By way of quick introduction, I'm Brock Reeve, the Executive Director of the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And I'd like to thank those of you who have come and those who will straggle in the door. Thank the speakers for participating in this conversation, and many thanks, of course, to Glenn and his colleagues at the Petrie-Flom Center for jointly hosting this with us on a topic of mutual interest that ranges from science to ethics and public policy and everything in between. Before I turn the session over to Willie Lynch, who will moderate it and introduce the speakers, I thought I'd reference a couple of papers that I came across recently that sort of set the stage, I think, for the talk, for this afternoon's discussion, because we're here talking about stem cell therapy and medical tourism, and the tagline of Peril or Promise raises a bunch of questions, or at least it should in your minds. Because tourism, medical tourism by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, many of our local hospitals here thrive on it, and many of the star hospitals across the country depend on the good aspects of medical tourism. But there was a recent article published a few months ago called Stem Cell Tourism, Hardly a Vacation. And the reason it has become an issue is because we have public figures like the New York Yankees pitcher Bartolo Colon, you have Peyton Manning, you have Rick Perry, all talking about going places and getting stem cells put into them for various reasons. And as this article points out, up and down might also describe prospects for the stem cell treatment industry. Anecdotes abound in which patients are cured of diseases that defy conventional medicine. But the field also has numerous patients who have not recovered, or whose deaths have followed expensive procedures, often performed overseas in industry-friendly havens through clinics affiliated with US doctors relying on the internet to draw patients. And that same magazine then went on, it was a science magazine, went on to do a survey of its readership, and that quick online survey, depends on which, if you want to look at the good news or the bad news, 58% they would not consider going to a foreign country to get, quote, a medical procedure done involving stem cells. On the other hand, 42% were a combination of somewhat likely, very likely, or already have. So that's a significant number. So a lot of people are facing these decisions today. And these decisions are not only for going to independent clinics, but these decisions also have to do with engaging in in stem cell in clinical trials, in things that are approved by regulatory bodies. So for example, there was an article in the journal Regenerative Medicine entitled Decision Making in Stem Cell Trials for Spinal Cord Injury. Okay, now I'm out of the light. And what was interesting, this study did a study of focus group and individual interviews with networks of professionals who were either doctors or allied health professionals, and with people, what they call personal networks, i.e. patients and their family. And what they were trying to do is find out sort of who had what role in the decision-making process. Because, as I said, the question of how to ensure informed decisions about participation in stem cell trials remains a source of ethical inquiry and debate. And I won't read, you'll be glad to know I won't read the paper. However, there are two interesting points. One is that when both networks, and I'm quoting here, and when they talk about networks, they talk about the professional network, i.e. the doctors and allied health professionals, and the personal networks, i.e. family and friends, express insufficient familiarity with the priorities and quality of life perspectives of the injured person to be able to inform or support decision-making, at least early time post-injury. Well, that's sort of a problem if people need to make decisions on this. And then they go on. And to summarize, they say, our results highlight a significant and multi-layered problem in decision-making for stem cell clinical trials for networks of individuals. And this is, again, in spinal cord injury. The data illustrate that networks of professional and personal networks, which fulfill an important role in decision support for vulnerable populations, have an unclear understanding of the decision-making framework. The highly personal dimensions of risk assessment and the perceived quality of life of the person with a spinal cord injury complicate the perceived ability of the network to offer decision support. This opacity fundamentally characterizes the problem. Both professional and personal networks express limited insights into these dimensions, and both defer decision support to the other, further compounding the problem. And the dynamic state of embryonic stem cell science adds to this complexity and further impedes meaningfully informed decision. And the final two sentences then, I think, lead us into today's conversation. So developments in stem cell research are advancing rapidly with constant pressure for translation from bench to bedside. Critical engagement and guidance both protect prospective human research subjects and safeguard public trust science. So to lead us in that critical engagement and to provide guidance is the panel with us this afternoon, which will be ably moderated by Willie Lench. Willie, to my right here, is an instructor in pediatrics at the Harvard Medical School, a principal faculty of the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, where he's also the advisor for education, and a senior scientist in the laboratory of George Daly, who sits right next to him at the moment, at Boston Children's Hospital. His lab research uses stem cells to better understand rare childhood diseases, and beyond the bench, he has been an advocate for stem cell and orphan disease research in various scientific, public, and policy forums. Willie.
Thank you very much, Brock. Thank you to everyone in the room for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and attend this panel today. I'm very grateful to both the HSCI and the Petrie Flom for convening a panel discussion on these topics. The issue of stem cell tourism is something that I've thought about a great deal as a scientist and as an individual, and many of my explorations have been guided by people in this room, and so I'm particularly thrilled to moderate today's discussion. I'll introduce our panelists in greater depth as they come up individually. Each is going to give an opening salvo of comments, about 6 or 7 minutes or so. But just briefly, they're George Daly from Children's Hospital here in Boston, Jill Lepore from the Department of History and Literature here at Harvard, Tim Caulfield, who visits us from foreign frozen land to the north, Alberta. Welcome, Tim. My friend and colleague, Insoo Hyun from Case Western Reserve, and your own Glenn Cohen from here at the Law School and Petrie Flom. And again, I'll have more to say about each of them as they come up. House rules, a couple of things. There are copies of the panelists' bios that are available outside the door, and there are probably a few here in the room as well. Maureen Herman from HSCI has some in the back if you'd like one of those to read. Each panelist will offer a short introduction on their own position or thoughts, and we'll have time for 1 or 2 quick questions between speakers. Now, when you ask a question, please make sure to use the microphone at your station. It has a button that says push. You have to continually hold it down. It's not one of these you click on and off, so be sure to hold the button down. The green light will be on, which means all eyes and ears are on you. After the final panelist gives introductory comments, who will be Glenn, we'll open it up to a broader discussion between panelists and the entire audience. So just by way of a short introduction, I authored a very brief piece last year in the journal Genome Medicine on public perceptions of stem cell and genomics research, and there are a couple of comments in there that I wanted to share with you. Though science is a fascinating endeavor for those of us in the laboratory, and I'm one of those guys, I'm fascinated by science, we should remember that public support of biomedical research typically relates to unmet clinical need. Investments in stem cell research have been sold, in part, by articulating its potential to improve human health. Many benefits have already come to pass from this research, and I'm quite confident that many more are in store. Unfortunately, despite the best of efforts within laboratories and clinics, a great many people continue to suffer to the point of desperation. Societal expectations for the fruit of stem cell research are high, but general understanding, particularly of limitations, is low. This gap in public understanding is a point of concern, especially when it comes to the evaluation of personal medical risk or the drafting of new legislation that hopes to regulate science. Especially considering the former, people sometimes do things despite having solid information to the contrary, especially if the only other option is to do nothing. This is part of the complexity of human existence in general, and interactions with a medically needy but autonomously acting public in particular. And so, bearing that in mind, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, friend and colleague George Daly, who will speak Stem Cells, the Gap Between Current Science and Clinical Implementation. George Daly has both MD and PhD degrees. He's the Sam Lux Professor of Hematology, Oncology, and Director of the Stem Cell Transplantation Program at Children's Hospital Boston and the Dana-Farber. We're about to find out how good of a computer guy he is. Oh, nice work. He's also a professor of biological chemistry and molecular pharmacology at the Harvard Medical School, an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, principal faculty member, and a member of the executive committee of the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And I would like to point out, was president of the International Society for Stem Cell Research when it drafted its guidelines, which very pleased that 3 authors of that document are here, George and Soo-Hyun, and also Pat Taylor, who's here somewhere. There he is. And so, very
Terrific.
take it away.
Thank you, Willie. Yeah, my goal today is to define and give a baseline for what is possible, where we are in the science, where we are in the clinical translation, and then to, I hope, act in some capacity to be able to provide a modestly authoritative view on the difference between the promise and the reality of today. I am a physician and a scientist. I direct the pediatric bone marrow transplant program at Children's Hospital. We take about 100 kids per year with inevitably fatal diseases, and we try to cure them. And we succeed about 50% of the time, which is one of the great triumphs of modern transplantation medicine. But it's those 50% in whom we fail that really drive and inspire us in stem cell research. In my own laboratory, we work with both hematopoietic or blood stem cells, as well as this range of pluripotent embryonic and induced pluripotent stem cells in an attempt to improve the transplantation strategies for the future. So one of the key take-home messages as we talk about stem cells is that there are different varieties. Not every stem cell is the same, and the confusion over nomenclature and properties of different stem cells actually are what contributes to some of the public confusion. The stem cells in our adult tissues, like the blood stem cell, the skin stem cell, or the mesenchymal stem cell, are restricted in their potential only to those tissues in which they reside. Not all tissues in our bodies regenerate or repair from stem cells. The majority of the brain doesn't repair by stem cells. The heart, even though controversial, my belief is, does not regenerate from stem cells. Parts of the pancreas, in particular the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas, may not regenerate from stem cells. And so, as an alternative source of cell therapies, scientists and physicians are looking to the early embryonic sources, the embryonic stem cells, which we know have the potential to give rise to any tissue in the body. Now, these have also been the subject of great public debate because of their derivation from human embryos. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we have developed an alternative source of pluripotent stem cells via a process called reprogramming. By simply introducing 3 or 4 genes that are naturally in embryonic stem cells, but moving them into adult tissue, we can reprogram a skin cell or a blood cell back to an embryonic state, creating what's called an induced pluripotent stem cell. And this technology, and the architect of this technology, Shinya Yamanaka, won this year's Nobel Prize in Medicine. Now, of course, the argument has been made politically that because we now have this alternative source of induced pluripotent stem cells, which don't involve the destruction of embryos, we therefore have obviated the need for embryonic stem cell research. This isn't the topic of the debate today, but I would argue as a scientist on the ground that there is still an ongoing need and interest in the biology of embryonic stem cells and their use in therapy. Now, induced pluripotent stem cells allow us to model human disease because we could create these cells from any individual with a genetic disorder, move them into the Petri dish where we can then study mechanisms. We're already using them in drug development, and one of the long-term promises of this research breakthrough is the ability to make rejection-proof cell therapies. Now, Stem cell therapy today, as opposed to what we hope to develop in the future, is established and is state-of-the-art and standard of care, if you will, for a variety of malignant diseases of the blood and bone marrow, leukemias, lymphomas, as well as a small percentage of non-malignant blood diseases like sickle cell anemia in its worst forms. We use skin stem cells in skin grafts and to some extent in the ex vivo and petri dish growth of skin, replacement skin, and that exploits a skin type stem cell. And recently, I would argue that the use of a particular limbal stem cell taken from the corner of the iris of the eye can be used to regrow the corneal surface. And I think that would be widely applauded as a current state of the art in stem cells. However, we are seeing a growing application in legitimate clinical trials of a variety of stem cells for any number of indications. Blood stem cells are now being tested in a variety of disease contexts outside of the blood, including things like cerebral palsy, spinal cord injury, where I would regard the evidence for preclinical efficacy from animal models to be very, very weak at best. Neural stem cells are being applied in spinal cord injury, mesenchymal stem cells in bone repair, inflammatory disease, and I'll talk even about the first embryonic stem cell trials. But it's important to realize that these are all experimental protocols, and there is great skepticism in the community of stem cell scientists as to whether we have the fundamental understanding of the biology of stem cells to predict that these will be effective. So successful stem cell therapy, like the emergence of any new biotechnology, takes decades, not years, and it will require scientific and clinical advances and significant regulatory and ethical oversight. So just to give you a little hint about what is actually going on today, if you go to the clinicaltrials.gov and search for stem cells, you'll see that the vast majority of current open stem cell trials involve legitimate applications and refinements of hematopoietic or blood stem cell therapy, bone marrow transplantation, cord blood transplantation. But there are a significant number of trials involving neural stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells, and a small number approved for embryonic stem cells. The first was the trial from Geron, famous for spinal cord injury, which was stopped short, not necessarily because of scientific or medical issues, but rather because of a reorientation of the business plan of the company. There's also a trial from ACT, a local Massachusetts company, applying products of embryonic stem cells to treat macular degeneration, and even the results of the first 2 patients have been reported far too early to claim any clinical success. The numbers of trials, however, are growing dramatically, not only here in the United States, but around the globe. We performed the vast majority of stem cell work, but in countries like China, we're seeing an increasing application, including in diseases where, once again, I would argue, the preclinical evidence is weak at best. Now, these are the legitimate trials. We're not even talking in these regard to the range of trials that have not gone through the normal institutional review process. In the context of the deliberations of the International Society for Stem Cell Research, when I was president, I impaneled this task force and served on the task force. In-Soo Hyun, who you'll hear from, was the leader of the task force, and we authored these guidelines which represented a roadmap for the way professional stem cell scientists and physicians would think about the proper clinical translation. The idea was to protect patients and promote standards, and we called for a prohibition against marketing of unproven therapies. Now, why are stem cells so different from drugs? We felt that stem cells required their own set of guidelines because they're fundamentally novel products, and they can persist over many years, sometimes for the life of the individual. So that creates very different complications of safety, very different concerns about informed consent from a drug which can be metabolized out of the body. So the core principles that perhaps In-Soo will talk in more depth about was the subject of any of these trials to rigorous peer review, high standards of voluntary informed consent, and the need for institutional oversight. And as we think about the many applications that we see of unproven stem cell interventions in patients around the globe, they're not occurring under these standards. Another very important point, and I want to say that even though I may come off as sounding very skeptical and somewhat conservative, in fact, I am very much driven by the need for medical innovation, and I very much appreciate the imperatives of physicians to provide sometimes innovative therapies to their patients in real time. But there are principles under which this can occur legitimately, distinct from the type of illegitimate attempts, especially those where the attempts are both financial as well as scientific or medical. So let me just leave you with a story of deja vu that was told by Jim Wilson, who was one of the early pioneers of gene therapy. And he was also subject to one of the great tragedies of the gene therapy endeavor, in that one of his patients in a clinical trial died. It was a patient, Jesse Gelsinger, at the University of Pennsylvania. And Jim, looking at what was happening in the world of stem cells, wrote this piece in Science, where he commented that the accelerated translation of gene therapy in the 1990s was driven by a simplistic theoretical model indicating the approach ought to work, a large population of patients with disabling or lethal diseases, unbridled enthusiasm of scientists in the field, and commercial development by the biotechnology industry. And he saw the hints of all of these elements in the stem cell world, and he was concerned that expectations for the timeline and scope of clinical utility of human ES cells have outpaced the field's actual state of development, undermining its success. It would be unfortunate if the field of human ES cell research missed this trajectory, lesson from history, and took a similar trajectory. And even though he wrote specifically about human embryonic stem cells, this admonition is equally applicable to any of the variety of stem cells which we'll hear about today, which are currently the subject of stem cell tourism. And I will leave it at that. Perhaps we have time for one or two questions, or I could wait till the panel discussion.
We do. We hope to take one or two burning questions in between panelists. Somebody has something on their mind. Maybe I'll start off. I've seen your famous file. George has this file of emails and notes that he's taken about phone calls from patients, parents of patients, family members of patients. What is the scope of this situation as a physician? How many people a week or a month or a year have called you for advice about going to the type of clinics that we're discussing today?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I mean, with Google, the information is so accessible, and my email is so accessible. So I get several a week. I've stopped printing them out, but for a number of years, I would print out these appeals that would come from all over the world, from family members or individuals talking about their loved ones or themselves and the desperation they felt. Because, I mean, as a physician, I appreciate there are many medical conditions for which modern medicine offers little more than support and comfort. And so they're desperate, and they will go and accept any risk and pay any price. And they're coming to me to ask whether or not I would bless that decision. I have a stack that's 6 inches deep. I've stopped printing it out, but the patients keep coming. I think the saddest ones are the ones who have already taken their child and gone through one of these interventions, either in the United States or elsewhere, and now have come to the Children's Hospital because that intervention has failed. And the worry is that they're concerned about having harmed their child. And the tremendous guilt that I've seen in that context is very, very moving.
Another question from the room?
A bit of an emotional backdrop for the subsequent conversations.
Well, it's why we're here. They're real people. Thank you, George. Now, among the many different things that I do is I teach an undergrad course with George in Stem Cell and Regenerative Biology Department, SCRB 167, and there are some scrub people here. It's nice to see them. The course is entitled, the name gets longer every year, Stem Cells and Regeneration in the Pathobiology and Treatment of Disease. It's known as I think to students as the class where patients come and visit. And every week we devote that week's lecture to a different system or disease, sort of loose category in the body like the lung or diabetes or the heart. We have an hour of lecture from a subject matter expert, and we're lucky to have many of those in the Harvard community. And then for the next hour, we bring in a patient or a family or the survivors or the spouses of non-survivors. And the students hear it like it really is from people who wish that they had better health or the people they love had simply lived longer. The last session that we have in the term is dedicated to clinical translation, and required reading there is this paper, Stem Cell Clinics Online, the direct-to-consumer portrayal of stem cell medicine. The senior and corresponding author is our next speaker, Tim Caulfield. I think that this paper and that last day really brings together a lot of the themes that we try to develop in the course about where science is, where the medicine is, how far we have to go, and who is waiting. And we never have problems finding students who want to present this paper. It doesn't have very many figures compared to a lot of others, but it offers so much food for thought. When we were talking about who to invite here, your name obviously was very prominent. I'm really pleased that you can be here. Going to talk to us today about stem cell tourism. Is the problem getting worse? And by way of introduction, Tim is the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy at the University of Alberta. He is also a Health Senior Scholar of the Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research, a professor of the Faculty of Law and School of Public Health, and Research Director of the Health Law and Science Policy Group, HEALS, within the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. And he also has a book out that will tell you how realistic your desire to have killer abs is, right?
That's right, yeah. Sexy abs is the goal of everyone, right?
That's right. It's no.
Interesting, you have the Canadian version. I don't know, that one's slightly more polite and more boring than the American.
I go to
I don't know how you got that.
I go to Canada to get my medications, obviously, and my books. So, welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here and to be among friends, and thank you very much for this kind invite. I'm going to dive right in, because I think my job really is to give you a sense of the nature and the scope of the stem cell tourism phenomenon. So what I'm going to try to do in the brief amount of time that I have is give you a sense of what the literature says about the problem, the degree to which it is a global phenomenon, talk about the drivers, and I think this builds very nicely on Jill's fascinating presentation, talk a little bit about the policy responses that have already happened, and then we can all speculate as a group about what's missing. So what is the problem? Well, if you were a patient and you wanted to know, it's funny because George, I get emails like George every day, and I got one a minute before this session started from a patient desperate for a therapy. And that patient said she goes to the internet, and this is for her child, and she types in stem cell therapy, and this is what pops up, right? You get all of these clinics, and they look phenomenally legitimate. They look like the real deal, right? They veil themselves in scientific language and lab coats, etc., and gives the impression that they have something real to offer. And what do they offer? They offer treatments for virtually everything. And our team is continually looking at these websites. These ones are kind of old. By old, I mean a year old, but they're continually emerging. This one company, this one's in Mexico, I believe, offers treatments for ALS, Alzheimer's, anti-aging, which we could all benefit from, right? Autism, brain damage in general, cancer, you name it, right? On and on and on. Here's another good example. This is a company that still exists in Ukraine. Again, to give you a sense of the things that they will offer. And these are offered as cures, as we'll see. What do they offer? They offer a cure for oncology, which I didn't know was a disease, diabetes, nervous system problems of everything. Again, aging problems, immune system, on and on and on. You get the sense, right? This is what's being offered to the public all over the world. it's also important to remember the scope of this phenomenon. We're largely concerned with the offering of bogus treatments for the serious stuff, right? But this is a broader cultural phenomenon, and stem cells now are everywhere. So if you Google stem cells, there are a lot of, particularly in the cosmetic universe, these stem cell facial creams that you can use. There's this great website where you can get stem cell cream. And George, there's stem cells right in that cream. This is probably a cheap way for your clinic to get stem cells. Did you know that you could keep them? Yeah, exactly. And you see this, and you hear the language, and again, it's always veiled in this legitimacy, very, very expensive. But even when you're doing that search, even when I was doing that search, you come back to these sad kind of stories, right, where people are offering these treatments for very debilitating illnesses. As mentioned by Willie, we did the study, and it came out in 2008, where we tried to do a very systematic analysis of what's being offered. So what we did is we pretended we had a group of coders, and we had them all go to these websites, and then we had them code and say, what is being offered, right? What's being offered to the public? And then what we did is we have technology assessment experts on our team. They actually mapped it against the existing literature. The bottom line is that it's being offered as routine, it's being offered as safe, and it's being offered as effective. That's what the public is being told about these treatments by these clinics. And then, of course, virtually at this time, none of what was being offered was matched what the scientific literature said. In other words, this is not efficacious routine treatment. These are unproven therapies. Virtually all of them. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, one could say, so what, right? So desperate people are accessing these treatments. What's the harm of this? Well, of course, there is real tangible harm, right? If you are actually injecting stem cells into people, and we don't know what they're doing. We really don't know what they're doing, but presume that some clinics there's actual harm that occurs. Tumors have been noted to grow. There have been deaths associated with these treatments. One of these clinics, they were injecting stem cells into the brain of a child, and the child died. You get the idea. Some real physical harm. In addition to that, there's financial exploitation, and this can't be minimized. We're talking about a lot of money here. Our study was about, I think, $27K was the average for every single treatment. So if you go multiple times and you have to travel, it quickly becomes hundreds of thousands of dollars that these families are spending to go to these treatments. Yes, in addition to that, this kind of phenomenon hurts the legitimacy of the entire field. I think it causes cast sort of suspicion across the entire field, and I've seen that in the emails that I get from the general public, where they're wondering what's real and what's not real. So I think that's one of the reasons entities like the ISSCR is very interested in this. In addition to that, it creates some real clinical and regulatory challenges, which we've seen right here in the United States. It is a global phenomenon. How big of a problem is this? It's very hard to get a sense of how big this really is because it's an internet-based industry, right? So it's very difficult to get a sense. But if you just look at the literature and what these companies claim, this is just one company, and this is actually kind of an old website. They say they've seen 5,000 patients since 2005, and that's just for the more serious thing, not including the sort of cosmetic surgeries. Someone from this clinic actually spoke to me, and they claim they saw 15,000 patients. Who knows? But I think it's thousands and thousands and thousands of patients from all over the world are going to these clinics. Very, very common. This is some work by the Hopkins group, Deborah Matthews group, where they've just mapped where these clinics exist. You can see they're all over the world, increasing number here in United States. We did a study of public representations of these clinics. So these are this is the representation. So this is sort of media representations of these clinics. So this isn't an actual account. This is the media representations, and you see just that. But still, that gives you a sense, right? A sense of where these clinics exist and the kind of profile they have. So China, big player here. India, Germany, etc. Right? You can see they're all over the world. Interesting thing, by the way, here we also found that almost 50% of the people going to these clinics were children. Right? So that's another important element to this story. What are the drivers? So what's caused this phenomenon? Well, this builds really nicely on what Jill was talking about. There have been so many promises. This is an area of science is truly exciting, a huge amount of potential, but it has been sold. It's been sold to the public, it's been sold to the funders, and that kind of promise permeates our culture now. You see these kinds of headlines. If you are a desperate mom with a sick child and you see these kinds of headlines, it does make that clinic in India and China seem all the more legitimate, right? When you see Peyton Manning, right, you guys heard this, right? Peyton Manning saying that he got therapy on his neck, and it's unclear whether that really happened. George, I don't know if you know. It's unclear whether it really happened. When you see headlines that say stem cells can treat diabetes, these kinds of things, of course, drive and allow this industry to thrive. We actually also did give you a sense of what our study said about the media. What is the actual tone of the coverage? This is a huge driver, I think. So what we did is we studied all of the media coverage of these clinics. And one of the things we coded for was the coverage positive or negative? Were they presenting these people traveling to these clinics as a positive story? And our results, I think, were remarkable. The blue is positive. So almost without exception, media representations of these clinics are positive. They're good news stories. They're personal interest stories, right? There's one dip there, and that dip is the ISSCR is responsible for that. So it's a little bit of a good news story that we can have an impact, and the media picked that up. But look how fast it bounced back. It's incredible how resilient this story is, how resilient this narrative is, right? Here's a sense of the kind of newspaper stories that are out there. Dakota was born blind, but now she can see, right? Which is not true, at least if not as a result of stem cell therapy. This is one of my favorite ones. This is from the Toronto Star, a very respectable newspaper in Canada, and a very good example of the kind of story. Again, it's not a good news story, but a sort of personal interest story. This is a desperate family raising money to go. And one of the things that enrages me about this is you can see in the newspaper, they tell you where you can send money to send this person to wherever to get this experimental therapy. Now, the harshest view of this, they're raising money to hand it over to a fraud. If you really want to be harsh, don't quote me on that. Here's a story that came out just days before I came here. This was on the Canadian National News Network, CTV. It's a group of kids in Atlantic Canada on a penny drive raising money to send their classmate to China to cure his blindness. And this breaks my heart. Here's the child who they're sending says, "I can't wait to see the sun in colors and trees." Right? And then they say they've raised almost 20,000, 35,000 needed to go. Fundraising, and there's going to be a dance last weekend. I mean, it breaks my heart. It almost makes me miss you just talking about it. And this is likely they're raising money to hand over to a fraud. Now, here's another interesting point of this story is when the public representations of this clinic, the providers and the advocates of these clinics are out there also. And we give you a really good, quick example, and if you're not, I'm almost done. This is an article I wrote with my colleague Amy McGuire on people like Peyton Manning using these therapies, right? And then I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, there's my buddy Peyton, talking about these, and I criticized the therapy, right? In the comments, which were aggressive and almost all negative, aggressive at me, is this one. Tim is part of the gang of Canadian bioethicists. I'm the least nutty. I'm the least nutty. And I love this, that I'm a nutball Canadian socialist bioethicist. And that's not true, because I'm not a bioethicist. And it's harsh. Like my research methods in this editorial are a joke, he says. And he says I don't know anything about it. The article quotes Mick Badia, who knows a thing or two about stem cells, right? A very respected Canadian researcher on this point. So this is how aggressive. You're going to go after these clinics. This is what you have to expect. And they sue people also, right? So it's the real deal here. Okay, the policy response, and then I'll stop down. How do you respond? Very, very difficult. It's an international phenomenon, internet-based. There is this huge patient demand. How do you respond? Well, we are starting to see some response. You're seeing physician groups sanction their doctors. You are seeing actual governments tightening up the regulatory loopholes that allow these companies to thrive. You see in some situations, governments actually shutting down clinics. And here in the United States, you have FDA warnings actually going out, being quite aggressive. Another thing that's happening is education, what I think is very important. Disease groups and scientific societies are doing a lot of that. That's all very good. Is it getting better? This is a study we just finished where we redid our 2008 study. We redid that exact study I told you about, and the sad thing, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. These clinics are portraying the knowledge as, few clinics portray the knowledge as incomplete, and almost all of them now presented as complete. So it's a really sad story. And in addition to that, once the clinics are shut down, the clinics just open up elsewhere. So what's missing? I hope that we can talk about that. I have a few ideas, but I'd like to hear what you think is missing. And I'll end there with a thank you to everyone. Thanks very much.
Really important research. So we've got a couple of questions. We'll go here and then to Professor Brock. Use your microphone if you would, please. Is there one there? Yeah, just hold down the button.
Thank you. That was really interesting. It reminds me a lot of the similar kinds of promises offered to couples who are trying to get pregnant, and they go around the world for various kinds of reproductive interventions. But the difference there, at least, is that some couples are getting pregnant, and there are some success stories. So I'm wondering if there are any successes here. I mean, why don't all the failures rise to the top?
It's a great question, and George can speak to this probably better than I can. I'm a real skeptic. I think that virtually everything that's being offered here is at best experimental, and any kind of benefit they're getting, there's some theories that they're getting a transient benefit from having maybe an immune response from having cells put into their body, but a very, very transient, no, as far as I know, no long-term benefit at all. You'll note that a lot of these clinics target things like autism, ALS, and MS, where there's often symptoms that come and go and where sort of subjective views can have play a role. So I'm very skeptical at this point. George?
I mean, mesenchymal stem cells, which were originally described in 1999, have been in clinical trials for a better part of a decade. Hundreds, very well designed against indications where we think we understand the properties of the cells, bone repair and regeneration. There is today no consensus of efficacy. There's no FDA-approved treatment, even for what would argue is probably the best understood stem cell. And all of these others are far afield of that.
And that Atlantic article, as George knows, that would be referring to a lot of those kinds of treatments. And the letters I got was, Caulfield doesn't know anything. There's thousands of clinical trials that show it work. And how do you respond to that? Dan?
Oh, thank you. You can see how clinically advanced I am. What kind of regulation of this advertising exists in some of the countries where this is common, and how does it compare with the regulation that may or may not exist in this country?
It's a great question, and let's just use China as an example. China allegedly, and Glenn could talk to this maybe better, and Sue also better than I can, but allegedly has a regulatory framework. It's unclear whether it's being applied in any kind of aggressive manner. We just finished this and submitted it for publication, a review of the popular representations of stem cell therapies in China, in Chinese newspapers, which is very interesting given the government control of the newspapers. And again, we found, I think it was 87% of those articles completely positive, almost no negative, and a few neutral. And all of the stories about stem cells are emanating from the providers, from the clinic, not from the scientific community.
Are they violating then these regulations, and could anything be done?
I think that they have like a tiered approach, and I would argue that they are violating their own regulatory rules by allowing these to go forward. Would you agree with that? Okay. Do you want to say it?
Maybe we'll take, if it's quick, and then we'll move on.
My question was just, I was on the slide that you mentioned about the students raising money to send the kid to China for therapy. They mentioned that it was experimental. I was wondering how many of these companies that advertise their services advertise as being bona fide or actually say that these are just experimental?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, in the second study that we did, that was that was our hypothesis. We thought that they would, in fact, we've talked about, Doug Sipp and I, and Unsu and I have talked about this also, that we thought that these clinics are nimble, and we thought what they might do is change from saying that these were effective therapies to saying that they were experimental. They haven't done that. That shift has not occurred, at least not to the degree that we hypothesized it would. They are saying that these things are efficacious and routine. In that story, you'll say the experimental, but the whole story is very, very positive, and it makes it sound like it's an efficacious treatment that the evil Canadian socialist medical system is holding back from this child. Thanks.
That'll help. All right, we're in the stretch. There have been many people that have spoken rather authoritatively about the ethical underpinnings of stem cell research in general, clinical implementation specifically. None comes to mind who I think has written more eloquently and to the point than Insoo Hyun. I'm very pleased that he could be here today. He's going to discuss therapeutic hope and its challenges for rational ethical discourse. Insoo is an associate professor of bioethics and philosophy, so he's actually one of those evil bioethicists that Tim was accused of being. Bioethics and philosophy at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. 2007, as I mentioned before, he was co-chair for the ISSCR, the International Stem Cell Society's task force, which drafted international guidelines for the clinical translation of stem cell research. He's the past chairperson of the ISSCR's Ethics and Public Policy Committee. And his book, which unfortunately isn't out today, so that we could offer it to you, will be out soon. It's entitled Bioethics and the Future of Stem Cell Research, and that will be coming from Cambridge University Press, the other Cambridge, the one with more pointy buildings.
Thank you.
Thank you, Insoo.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here. And my talk, I think, dovetails very nicely with the end of Tim's, and I think it fits in nicely with the beginning of Glenn's. So I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk about therapeutic hope. I want to contrast therapeutic hope with other related concepts, such as therapeutic misconception and therapeutic misestimation. So therapeutic misconception is the idea that when a human subject enters into a clinical trial, they may be confused about what's going on, what's happening to them. They may think that they're actually getting a therapy that's designed specifically for them to make them better, and not quite understanding things like randomization, control groups, that they're actually part of a study to expand generalizable knowledge. They may not actually get the efficacious or the experimental therapy, so on and so forth. So that's a misunderstanding of the situation. Therapeutic misestimation is close to that. That's where somebody misestimates the likelihood of benefit or the magnitude of benefit of being involved in a clinical trial. So these are cognitive false beliefs. Therapeutic hope, I think, is in a separate category, but it's related in very important ways with these other categories. So I just want to focus our attention on therapeutic hope. So in ethics, as in medicine and in the law, the diagnosis of the issue, the diagnosis of the problem is extremely important in order to issue forth a sensible recommendation or a sensible prescription. So when you look at what the prescription is so far about how to deal with stem cell tourism, so far the International Society for Stem Cell Research and others have proposed the following types of recommendations. More information for patients, right? So our task force came up with a patient handbook that is attached to the guidelines that you can distribute and answers people's questions. There's a website that people can go to for the ISSCR where it answers questions about therapies and travel abroad, so on and so forth. So one approach would be information, right? An informative approach. The other recommendation would be regulation. Regulation of China, regulation in the US, regulation wherever. So these strategies, in my view, aim to limit both the supply and the demand for stem cell tourism, right? Working at both ends. But what's highly interesting to me, though, is both strategies work off of sort of like an informative model, right? Or one that sort of frames the issue largely in terms of rational discourse. And I think that's a good way to go, but it's incomplete. Right? Because it seems to assume that the patient or the patient's family in most cases are what we would call sort of, rational decision makers in the sense of what they aim to do is maximize their expected utilities. And so what you have to then do is give them the right information to then make their rankings and they pursue their their goals. But that approach is limited in a number of ways, right? So one is it's limited by the uncertainties that abound in the stem cell field, the uncertainties of what could happen. It's also limited in the sense of it models the problem in terms of a buyer beware problem. So what people need to do is be more informed, take better responsibility over their choices. That's not, in my view, a very great approach, because as we've seen, the buyers, so to speak, the consumers in most of these cases are children. And the buyer beware sort of, it's your life, it's your money, it's your autonomy argument, I don't think applies in those cases. But what I want to really talk about is how it's incomplete in another more important sense, and that is it doesn't really capture the third element of what feeds or could be feeding stem cell tourism, which is therapeutic hope. So I want to make a distinction between the cognitive sort of approach and information approach and the misconception approach and the false belief approach with therapeutic hope, which is, I think, more of a phenomenon that's not so much of an issue of having the false belief. Therapeutic hope is, I think, very similar to what we've already discussed in bioethics and in medicine with regard to the issue of medical futility. So the analog would be sort of like this. False hope. False hope would be like futility in cases where there's no chance that therapy will work, 0% chance. Giving aspirin for cancer, there's no way that that's going to cure cancer, right? Or cardiac massage for a ruptured heart, not going to work. So false hope I would put in terms of that kind of futility. There's no chance that that will work. But once you get above, in the area of futility debate, above 0%, very slim chance, or we don't really know what the chance is, then you're in a much more rich and much more interesting debate. Likewise with therapeutic hope, because I don't want to talk about false hope. Yeah, I want to set that aside. I want to talk about therapeutic hope in that other sense of we can't rule out the very, very slim possibility, and we may not understand the mechanisms of how it might happen, but something might work. As long as that's there, patients, I think, can latch on to therapeutic hope. Okay. So let me just back up a bit and frame this issue of therapeutic hope more in terms of other concepts that I think are very important for our discussion. First one, spirituality. So I want to talk about spirituality, and I want to contrast that with religion. So by spirituality, I don't mean religion or religious belief. Spirituality could be defined as a person's search for meaning or purpose in life. Spirituality, in this broader sense, typically involves experiential and emotional aspects of personal connection, inner peace and support, right? So people can find spirituality through things other than religion. Right, so some people might find spirituality through connection to nature, music and the arts, connection to a particular community. I am friends with our university hospital's chaplain, and what he told me was in his 25 plus years of being a chaplain at our hospital, he can count on one hand the number of times that religion ever came up. The number, on one hand in 25 years, where a patient actually said, what does my religion say about a feeding tube? Or what does my religion teach about such and such? Maybe 5 times. What did they really want to talk about was this issue of spirituality, which is a much broader view. 77% of patients, according to a study, want to talk about spiritual care, but only 10 to 20% of doctors ever discuss the issue with them. Okay, so there's a big discrepancy in that. Now, spirituality, distinct from religion, that's in the background. Spiritual distress is where people are unable to find sources of meaning, comfort, and connection. And illness can often trigger this kind of spiritual distress. So for example, when you're ill, you may have a reduced ability to seek out ways to fulfill your spiritual needs, or you may feel isolated from your normal routines, such as your ability to attend church or other community gatherings. Okay, so spirituality, spiritual distress, and hope. Hope is, I believe, the antidote to spiritual distress. Hope is normally the antidote to fear. And the information and rational discourse approach, that orientation, is not really the antidote to spiritual distress, at least not for most people I know. Maybe some philosophers, you give them more information, they feel less spiritual distress, but I kind of doubt that that's the case. Okay, so we're going to try to better diagnose what is the issue. Part of it is information, lack of information, but I think a big blind spot in the debate so far is spiritual distress and therapeutic hope, which is a cluster of concepts that stand slightly apart from the others. There's not a lot written on therapeutic hope and spiritual distress. There's there's a lot written on spirituality. There's not a lot written on therapeutic hope. The only thing I could really find that was of interest to me was Chris Freudner at New England Journal of Medicine wrote a very nice commentary about hope, and he said that in his experience, he's a clinician at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, so based on his clinical experience, hope is not one thing. Like they talk about hope all the time in the clinic, and you don't want to remove hope from the patient or you don't want to remove hope from the family, but hope is not one monolithic thing. There's an architecture to hope. So the hope for a cure might form the roof, the aspirational goal, right, that points toward heaven. But under that aspirational goal of I hope for a cure are the pillars that support that. And the pillars of hope are going to be more mundane kinds of hopes, like everyday kinds of hopes, like, I hope I'm not a burden on my family. I hope that I get a good night's sleep. This is what Parkinson's disease patients say. I have dyskinesias. I can't sleep through the night. I hope I get a good night's sleep. I hope I find some meaning and learn something from this experience. So the pillars of hope, I think, are really what people need to address, not this overarching thing, which really is a placeholder. It's a placeholder for wanting to remain engaged with the future in some way. Okay, so the preliminary conclusion is you have a cluster of concepts that's not identical to and exhausted by a discussion of therapeutic misconception and cognition and information. It's not exhausted by that. I think it's related, but it's slightly apart from that. So if that's the diagnosis, then the prescription ought to be a little bit different than give them more information. So what should we do? How do you address this other cluster of concepts responsibly for patients? How do you manage therapeutic hope without at the same time inappropriately manipulating it? And this is a serious issue. Just to give you just a real quick example, in the Geron trial, the spinal cord injury trial, which, as George mentioned, was halted, there are newspaper reports of that I read of the first person enrolled, Timothy Atkinson. He said it was God's will that he went and got his injury and that he's in this trial. He's framing it as a God's will issue. Katie Shaffrey, who is the last patient that was enrolled, she said through her experience with this, she wants to find some reason why all this happened to her. Okay, that to me, those are signals of spiritual distress and not so much about not having the right information, because presumably they were consented rigorously about what the aim of the study is, what was happening, what's going to happen to them with the cells. And they passed that, and they were consented, and that went through the IRB. But they still have these lingering issues. So what do we do? Well, the literature in spirituality and hope come to us from family medicine and from the nursing literature. And I think we ought to extend that discussion into this field. We need a lot more empirical research about what do they actually mean when they say, I want a cure. That's a placeholder for lots of other everyday hopes. And we want to dig down and find out what is that and address those and find support for that. Because in the place of having support for that, I think people seek out these therapies. So if you want to have, I think, a more well-rounded approach, it's not just information, it's not just regulation, it's the antidote. You need an antidote for spiritual distress. So I apologize for not providing real analytical, tight philosophical arguments today, because I don't think it's really easy to do that on a topic like this. I did a lot of vague rhetorical hand-waving, so I'll just have to leave you with that. Thank you.
Motivations and goals of patients here are very complex. I think that sheds some light on some things that we should keep in mind. Question for Insoo before we move on? Oh, you're on the spot. Go ahead.
That was really interesting. I wonder. I mean, have you seen the recent literature on how people perceive the chances of cure for things like cancer treatment? So I think the hope. I think perhaps people really are hoping for a cure. Is where I'm going with this. There was a study that I think it just came out. They asked. It was from the UK. They asked patients what they thought was going to happen with their chemo when it was really palliative. Something like 60% said they thought it was going to cure them. Now, do you think that they are, in that statement of 60%, they're really kind of encapsulating the kind of hope you're talking about, or do you really think they're talking about cure?
I don't know. That's an empirical question. I think we need to do the empirical research. Yeah, it's sort of like drill down. What do they mean, actually? I mean, what's fascinating about this commentary that the pediatrician wrote, he said, they always start with that. I hope that we can get a cure for so-and-so. And you say, well, I don't know if that may be possible. When you start asking, so what else are you hoping for in light of that? It may not happen. Then they start talking about these other things that I think really are the support for the overarching placeholder. Yeah, but we have to do the research. We don't know.
Let's come back to that when the entire panel convenes. Our final speaker is the architect of today's proceedings. Very welcome. Very happy to welcome you to your own event, Glenn. Glad you could be here. I think Glenn's comments are going to tie in very nicely to some other things that have been said, especially where Tim observed that 50% of the patients that are going out to clinics worldwide are children. Glenn is going to speak today about stem cell tourism, children abuse, and reporting. Quickly, Glenn is an assistant professor here at the law school and co-director of the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. He's currently a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, which is really cool. Congratulations on that. And a Greenwald Faculty Scholar for this academic year. His edited volume, The Globalization of Healthcare, Legal and Ethical Challenges, is going to be out soon from Oxford University Press. I think they duel with the Cambridge University Press, so you can look at that. He's currently at work on a single-authored book for that same press entitled Patients with Passports, Medical Tourism, Law and Ethics. Take it away.
Thanks very much. So this is what I've already done on the subject. As Willie mentioned, this is the book I'm working on now, and hopefully we'll get done by May. I'm kind of an industrious person. I'm going to present on this chapter today, the stem cell therapy chapter, but I want to make clear that this is one piece of a much larger project of medical tourism, and there are a lot of interesting cross currents here. So let's talk about experimental therapies in particular. I'm going to be able to skip through. One of the great pleasures of this panel is that they've said all the things that I expected them to, so I'm going to be able to skip through a lot of the slides. But let me just emphasize this one slide, which is to say, even though I think most of us have a decidedly negative view of the stem cell tourism industry, I think that's probably an accurate characterization. It's also worth understanding that part of the motivation for patients to go abroad is frustration of the long regulatory cycle involved in drug approval, which stem cells are kind of being pushed into in the US. And as Insoo and Pat Taylor and some others have written about, one of the great problems here is that probably the existing regulatory approval schemes are not well suited to stem cell therapies. They're probably not going to be the optimum, and we need to think about other innovative pathways. And part of what we're seeing is actually the stem cell tourism is kind of people completely avoiding the regulatory pathways, the clinical pathways. And I think part of what we need to think about, and we can talk about in the Q&A, and again, Insoo and Pat have written quite a lot about, is how to put this back into the regulatory, scientific, clinical realm, not alienate it altogether. But that's not going to be my focus today. We already heard what stem cells are. We've heard quite a bit about what stem cell therapies might look like. I'm going to skip through that relatively quickly. Again, the thing to emphasize here is that currently, with the exception of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation for blood disorders, all other stem cell therapies are unproven. They are experimental. Not only is there no proof of benefit, there is some evidence of risk of harm, which we'll talk about in a second. We talked a little bit about the scope of stem cell therapy. A couple of these studies, including the one that Tim did, have been mentioned already. But I want to take one more of these studies that we haven't talked about, which has a little bit more of a narrative arc to kind of emphasize what I'm going to talk about today. So this is a study by Hayden Chen and Herbert Gottweiss. They intensively examined the experience of patients that had gone for stem cell therapy to the BK group in China. China is one of the #1 destinations. The BK is probably the biggest purveyor of this, so this can be not completely modal, but I think gives us a good picture. Patients report on their outcomes similar to numerous blogs and statements and exchanges. They all are full of praise about their experience at BK, which is interesting. One patient, I picked out a few quotes from the study I think are particularly probative. One patient, an adolescent girl who had been wheelchair-bound most of her life, said, quote, that she felt good after the stem cell treatments, which were combined with Chinese acupuncture. Her mother was a little bit more forceful in her views. I'm going to quote her mother now. Her mother says, quote, the Chinese doctors are better than the Canadian doctors. Canadian doctors are greedy. They work for the rich, but the Chinese doctors are happy to help. They are more responsible to their patients, more professional. Our doctors in Canada said Chinese medicine was 30 years ahead of Canada. We think highly of Chinese doctors. We receive very good care, have positive experience. Here to know that you've done that and you've tried everything for your child. even if that means going offshore and trying something experimental. So you can see the politics of hope from Insu's talk kind of rearing their head here, as well as suspicion about the motives of home country doctors and portrayal of foreign doctors as more advanced. A number of these interviews, I'm going to be talking about children with you today, a number of these interviews were with parents who took young children abroad. The mother of a 3-year-old child with cerebral palsy took her child for stem cell treatments in China, and she, in her interview, emphasized the way in which seeking the treatment fit with her conception of good parenting, noting, quote, "Like any parent, you want to do the best you can possibly do with your child, and at the end of the day, you want to know that you've done and you've tried everything, even if that means going offshore." Another patient sounded a similar note regarding her child, referred to as C in the study, treatment for serooptic dysplasia, albeit there was a bit more of a tone of desperation. This is the last quote I'll read. "C was only 18 months old. His health was deteriorating. We had been told numerous times when C was admitted to the hospital, all we can do for C is try to stabilize him and try to level out his blood sugars because there's no treatment available for this disorder. Well, for us as a family, the reality was, do we continually risk C dying in a hospital in the United States where there is no treatment? Or do we risk an unproven experimental treatment in China that may give him a better quality of life? We are extremely thankful that C was accepted for umbilical stem cell treatments in China," unquote. These are the kinds of parents that are taking their children abroad, very young children. But the dark side is that there have been various adverse event reports about what's happening here. I'll just pick out one that I think Tim had the slide up, but he didn't tell you about it. An Israeli child and his family traveled to Russia to receive an unconventional stem cell therapy to treat the rare and severely disabling neurological disorder called ataxia telangiectasia. I'm going to get that totally wrong, but luckily we have some real doctors here to correct my pronunciation. The treatment did not improve the child's symptoms and instead caused recurring headaches, which researchers in Tel Aviv, Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv determined was the result of abnormal growths, that is, tumors in the child's brain and spinal cord that developed from the stem cell-based injections. Okay, so that's the data, and the question is, what does this mean for the law? Well, my claim is going to be a provocative one. I like to be provocative, so today will be no exception. What I want to convince you of is that under existing American law, and Tim's actually done a nice analysis under Canadian law that's largely similar, but under existing American law, this falls within the coverage of existing child abuse and neglect statutes. That's my claim. My second claim is that that's a good thing, and that's actually the right tack to take. And the third is that we should conceive of treating physicians in the home country's responsibilities here for disclosure as tracking their disclosure for other kinds of child abuse and neglect. Okay. So first, the first claim. What's the U.S. approach to child abuse in terms of medical cases look like? Well, the U.S. has largely adopted a kind of a balancing approach to parental rights and the protection of children that waxes and wanes based on the area of law involved. As the U.S. Supreme Court put it, custody, care, and nurture of the child resides first in the parents, but the state also has an interest in protecting children's health and safety, both as vulnerable populations and as future citizens. For our purposes, I think the best analogy is actually parents who opt for non-stem cell experimental or alternative therapies over conventional and clinically established ones. These are often very fact-bound assessments, but I'm going to try and draw a few more general lessons to it. Although it's been more than 3 decades since these cases were in the heyday, actually the leading precedents on this subject, child abuse and neglect involving experimental therapies, go back to the late 70s, early 80s during the Leotril era. This was an experimental drug used or claimed to be used to be treating cancer. And I'm going to tell you about 2 major precedents, one from New York, one from Massachusetts, just to give you a flavor of how I think the analysis would go. We don't have any cases yet analyzing stem cell therapies under this rubric, but I think these cases are pretty good guides. The first is a 1979 New York Court of Appeals case allowing the state to intervene based on a claim of child neglect when parents attempted to treat their 7-year-old who suffered from Hodgkin's disease with nutritional and metabolic therapy, including injections of Leotril, instead of standard therapies of radiation and chemotherapy. So the court said, quote, The parents, once having sought accredited medical assistance and having been made aware of the seriousness of their child's affliction and the possibility of a cure if a certain mode of treatment is undertaken, have provided for their child a treatment which is recommended by their physician and which has not been totally rejected by all responsible medical authority. That's how they stated the standard. And they said on the particular facts of this case that these findings are supported by the record that numerous qualified doctors had been consulted by Dr. Schachter, who was the one who was providing the Laetrile, and have contributed to the child's care. The parents have both serious and justifiable concerns about the deleterious effects of radiation treatments and chemotherapy, that there is medical proof that the nutritional treatment being administered to the child is controlling his condition and the treatment is not toxic, as is the conventional means. So therefore, they allow the treatment to go forward. Now, you might think that's good evidence that stem cell therapy does not fall within the ambit of child abuse and neglect cases, at least in New York under this precedent. But I think not, and here's why. One thing to make it important here is that there's a lot of deference given to the home country physician in this case. And the court emphasizes the fact that they were able to find not just one, but several doctors who were licensed in the state, who could point to evidence in peer-reviewed journals of clinical effectiveness, and there was some at the time of Laetrile. And that was why they were deferring to what the patient was doing. I want to suggest to you that there are important differences between that situation and stem cell therapies. First of all, it's not a doctor who's licensed to practice in the jurisdiction who is performing the stem cell therapies. You're going abroad for this. And also, there's really a flavor. What the court was saying is you can try this first because it's not toxic. There's no evidence that it's toxic. And then later on, you can move to chemotherapy. I want to suggest that's quite different from the stem cell case where, in fact, the major risk is that this is toxic, that this is harmful. It's not merely a layering of possible treatments. Let me give you one more example of a court precedent. This is a Massachusetts one, roughly contemporaneous, involving the Supreme Judicial Court, Massachusetts' highest court, ordering that a 3-year-old be given chemotherapy treatment for leukemia over parental objection, and also the child be removed from parental custody because it held that evidence supported the findings that the condition was fatal if untreated, that chemotherapy was the only available medical treatment offering a hope for a cure, and the risks of treatment are minimal when compared to the consequence of allowing these diseases to go untreated. The parents then went back to the court and said, well, at least allow us to give the Laetrile and the metabolic therapy along with the chemotherapy. And once again, the SJC said, no, you can't do that. Faced with the facts that metabolic therapy was not only medically ineffective, but was poisoning the child, the judge inescapably concluded that the treatment was not consistent with good medical practice, and most important, was contrary to the best interests of children. So I think this precedent is a much surer guide to the way we should think about stem cell therapies. And in fact, if you wanted me to state what I think the rule ought to be, and I'm going to do this in the interest of time, I'll skip some of this, is to say the state should seek to intervene unless there's strong scientific evidence that the risks to the child involved are minor and or that they are outweighed by the promise of therapeutic benefit as demonstrated through appropriate preclinical testing. That's the standard I think we should be using in these cases. And I will tell you, though, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you, under that standard, very, very few of any of the treatments being offered would fall to satisfy that standard. Very few would satisfy it. So in fact, my own view is that most of the existing practice of taking children abroad for stem cell therapies falls comfortably within the ambit of existing law to claim it as child abuse and neglect. And again, I am sympathetic to these parents. These are parents not trying to hurt their children. But in these experimental cases that I'm using as the precedent here, that was true as well. And while I'm very libertarian and very deferential to individuals' choices, and especially terminally ill individuals' choices about their own treatment options, I think when you're talking about children, adolescents may be a bit different. When you're talking about children, I think the state has an appropriate parents patriae way of intervening. So just a couple of nuances just to say before I sit down. The first is that I'm very open to creating safe harbor for any therapy that's part of a clinical trial at the current moment. If you could get it in a clinical trial approved by the FDA, I'm all right with the idea that you may be able to get it outside of a clinical trial. I think we should create a safe harbor against child abuse. Second of all, I want to just sort of be open here about the fact that this is not a happy resolution.
Guardianship here would have to be something more like full guardianship, not merely medical guardianship or medical custody. And actually, what we know about children in institutional care and state care is that they often don't do very well, and that terminally ill children or severely ill children do even less well. Nevertheless, I do think that this is consistent with our existing practice as child abuse and neglect to intervene. I just don't want to sugarcoat what we're talking about. And finally, the most difficult thing here is in terms of getting the information. Often in other kinds of child abuse and neglect, the physician who sees the patient could see a bruise, or a social worker, or the like. It's all within the same system. Here, the great difficulty is that the activity which we think of as child abuse and neglect is going to take place thousands of miles away. So for this to come to the attention of social services, what it requires is for treating pediatricians to essentially end up being informants to some extent to social services about what parents are thinking of doing. Again, not a happy situation, not an easy situation. My own view is that this is a multi-step process. The first is to discuss treatment options and encourage parents to use treatment options within the established clinical practice. The second is to dissuade them from these experimental therapies. The third is to threaten to report them. And only then, when that's all exhausted, and yet a pediatrician comes to the conclusion that a parent will be taking a child abroad for a therapy that has no proof of benefit but has some indication of harm, only then do I think we should be reporting. And I'm hoping that those other steps stop us from having a lot of reporting like this. But I do think when you reach that point in the clinical encounter, this is child abuse just like other forms of child abuse and neglect. Thank you.
And so we've got about a half an hour left for our reception. I hope you'll join us outside and also join me in thanking our panelists.